book club. Is anybody joining today? Maybe we might be talking to ourselves just a little bit on this one as we discuss the meta language of race and African American women's history. And we are on the second section. This is our second live discussion because we had a little kerfunkle. I have mom brain to the nth degree. And this is like the last week or two before grad school starts back up for me. And maybe I'm a little frantic. Maybe that's a shared emotion amongst many of us who have been relishing the summer and being delusional, like we don't need to finish a grad school program. I feel
Jouelzy's
like
not
others
giving
can relate.
herself enough credit.
Huh?
Jouelzy's not giving herself enough credit.
Yeah, that I have a baby.
Running 50, 11 businesses.
We
Got
went
a
to the
whole
cardiologist
baby.
today. Yeah.
A
Yeah.
whole baby.
Yeah.
Got
Yeah.
her whole hair did.
I did.
It's
That
a
was a
whole
journey.
life.
We out here living, okay? But I
Yes.
feel like it just sometimes I feel bad when life interferes with really good books that we've selected. Like I still feel bad
Yeah.
that I was so tapped out when we did Wayward Lives.
That's fair.
That I think for like December, January, we're probably gonna pick extremely simple books and then revisit discussions on books that we did not that I feel like should have gotten better due from us.
If we can, because I know that I can go on a tangent, and I know that I appreciate can indulge my tangents.
Because I am a tangent
But
person. Yeah.
we can do that together. But if I can for a second, I think that there's something to give credit and credence to that kind of circular motion of returning to ideas. And I was just reflecting on that today of like the fact that I used to constantly beat myself up for like needing to return to material in order to feel like I fully grasped it or understood it. And eventually at a certain point I just leaned into that as kind of like my methodology of reading. Um for instance, I was thinking about like how I'm going to be using Fanon in a part of my research now in a way that I didn't expect to, and how something I might do is record myself reading Wretched of the Earth so that I could then listen back to it again, and how that kind of creates a different way of engaging with it, right? When you listen to it versus just reading it the first time. But I always read material once or twice, right? And maybe one time I'm annotating it, and then a second time I'm writing along with it. Maybe a third time I'm just straight reading it. And each of those experiences is different and unique. And then by the third time or something, I feel like a totally robust relationship to it. So I feel like I'm not saying that has to be everyone's relationship to it, but I feel like encouraging that or recognizing that or saying, hey, that is a mode of like engagement, and like being like, hey, you're not just a slow reader, or you're not just like a really slow reader, but like you're a really meticulous or methodical reader, or like just encouraging that kind of, circular motion and something like that. So just saying that I would not hate revisiting
Okay.
materials that we've done, not just because we feel like, oh, we didn't give credence to it, because I do share in that sentiment even in classwork, where I feel like even with this text, Metalanguage of Race, we talked about like having it in a classroom, and I felt like, oh, I feel like we didn't really give justice to it, either because of the span of the class. So many times they overload a syllabus for a 10-week class or a 13-week class, and so you had us read 600 pages, 300 of it Hegel, and we only discussed 20 pages in class. I feel gypped. Like that has happened so many times in grad school, where you feel like you want to revisit something. So just to give an amen to that sentiment.
Yeah, I was going through my second trimester in December and it kicked my ass, you know? I think this motherhood journey is ass kicking to the nth degree, but I wanted it so badly that I'm just kind of like, you know what? I love it still. Do I recommend? I'm happy to be here. Okay.
Ashe and amen. Yeah, I had another peer who had a motherhood journey at the same time
Yeah.
as you actually in my program, and I was like, "God damn!" And I didn't know about it because I was, very distant from my department at the time, and I was like, "God damn!"
It is. It's
Cause
just a lot of like, wow, women are just really doing this, and it's just like accepted as, oh, you just do it. Like there's no support. This is kind of wild. Okay, but to end the tangent that I could go on forever and ever about, y'all, this syllabus is great. I think I need to do more promotion. I'm gonna send out more newsletters because this is a really good. I need to get on Instagram and read. Today's section is the racial constructions of gender. It is on page 15 of the syllabus, and if you're just reading, it is 250. I don't know why the other day I said 253 to a person about the section we're doing, because when I pulled up, depending on the version you have, depending on the edition of the print you have, this is on page 256 of the article. And we're going to read. It's shorter. This one is only like a page and a half. And I really think that this section relates to a good bit of kind of where discourse and pop culture has gone today. And really would kind of undergirds and illuminates the sort of politics that I've taken around luxury and dating discourse and relationship advice targeted at Black women. Because I feel like those sort of veins of pop culture discourse are often the vehicles for mis and disinformation that travels specifically to Black women in order to get us to tap out of a collective mindset. And it's kind of hard with the way social media conversations go today, with this sole push for soft life and, no labor. And I have no desire to commit any labor, to talk about being committed to a collective struggle, because just that terminology sounds so like, why are you asking me to be a mule? And the collective struggle is not about muling. It is about, pushing back and pushing for the things that will actually benefit the whole, so that you as the whole woman, and not to be gender essentialist, because that whole woman for me is not, or for the politics of the book club, is not about biology, but like this idea that you get to be a whole person within that identity of your womanhood. And that's sort of what, it sounds like a word salad, but it means something.
no, I caught the nuance.
Okay.
It's not a word salad if you catch the nuance, especially in the present moment, the contemporary moment we're in right now.
Well, let's start off. One of my faves is quoted here. My faves that has really troubled the way I think about Black identity.
Miss Fields, no kin.
Yeah, I mean, maybe we were saying last time, maybe we should read a little. We're trying to do this Black feminist reader. I would like us to visit maybe one thing by her, because she really shakes the table, as they say. Her and Karen, they some table shakers. All right, I'm gonna start by reading. I'm gonna read the first two paragraphs and see where we go from here. To understand race as metalanguage, we must recognize its historical and material grounding, what Russian linguist and critic M.M. Botkin referred to as the power of the word to mean. The power evolves from concrete, situational, and ideological context. That is from, and I'm sorry if I mispronounce these people's names. I'm not that, some of this theory people I haven't read yet. This power evolves from concrete, situational, and ideological context, that is, from a position of enunciation that reflects not only time and place, but values as well. The concept of race in its verbal and extraverbal dimension, and even more specifically in its role in the representation as well as self-representation of individuals in American society, what psychoanalytic theorists call subjectification, is constituted in language in which, as Botkin points out, there have never been neutral words and forms that belong to no one. Language has been completely taken over, shot through with intentions and accents. The social context for the construction of race as a tool for Black oppression is historically rooted in the context of slavery. Barbara Fields reminds us the idea one people has of another, even when the difference between them is embodied in the most striking physical characteristics, is always meditated by the social context within which the two come in contact. race came to life primarily as a signifier of the master-slave relation, and thus emerged superimposed upon class and property relations. Defined by law as animate chattel, slaves constituted property as well as a social class, and were exploited under a system that sanctioned white ownership of Black bodies and Black labor. Studies of Black women in slavery, however, make poignantly clear the role of race, not only in shaping the class relations of the South's peculiar institution, a nod to what they were calling slavery, but also in constructing gender's power to mean. Sojourner Truth's famous and haunting question, "Aren't I a woman?" laid bare the racialized configuration of gender under a system of class rule that compelled and exploited women's physical labor and denied them legal right to their own bodies and sexuality, much less the bodies which they gave birth. While law and public opinion idealized motherhood and enforced the protection of white women's bodies, the opposites held true for Black women's. Sojourner Truth's personal testimony demonstrated gender's racial meaning. She had plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no male slave had outdone her. She had given birth to 13 children, all of whom were sold away from her. When she cried out in grief in the depths of her motherhood, none but Jesus heard. I personally, as a matter of fact, you know what? Today I'm prepared. My iPad is right here. I'm gonna pull up my notes from the first two times I've read this article. Talking about rereading, this is probably the most reread article I've ever hit. But like, I time and time again, I really just appreciate that Higginbotham, for someone who is a Harvard professor and really could, take the, what's his name, that man that wrote Black and Blurred, route towards,
Fred Moten.
yeah, the really sort of inaccessible.
You didn't see my roll my eyes. And I put them back in my head.
Yeah, like there are definitely people who hit the same subjects, who have the same sort of fixation on, and I don't, not fixation as a negative term, but have this sort of engagement with the French theorist Foucault and the like, that really could, if they wanted to, Higginbotham really could have given a really inaccessible, jargony, heavy read on what she's trying to say. But I think the commitment to making this more accessible and really, really breaking down the theory that she's presenting is really, I think, should not be overlooked, cannot be overstated.
It's succinct, it's clear. Each point kind of scaffolds to the next.
I really like where she takes, is that how you, Bakhtin, MM, the dialogic imagination. Have you read that?
No.
The point she takes from the Russian linguist about the power and the word to mean in the first paragraph. That the concept of race in its verbal and extra-verbal dimension, and in its role in the representation as well as self-representation of individuals in American society, is a language in which is constituted in a language that is no aspect of American English is neutral, is basically the point.
Mm-hmm.
There are no neutral words and forms that belong to no one. Language has completely been taken over, shot through with intentions and accents. Yeah. And even how this goes back to, a text that was a little less accessible. Spiller's Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe. And the idea of where language comes from and how we use metonomic language and how we refer to each other and we engage with each other. And I think Spiller's was kind of engaging more from like how we talk about each other as Black people to Black people, and how we are shaping and like advocating for ourselves, and the sort of how that gets us to fall into certain politics that actually are against our own good. Higginbotham really is breaking this down, that like, baby, there's no language in there's no part of American English that isn't touched by race. And she's setting up this argument for yeah, how this then relates to gender.
Hmm.
Okay. The questions that we are going to ask today starts on page 40, where I do ask the question about Foucault. Oh, that's from the racial part. Okay. No, we're on page 42 of the syllabus. Quoting the Russian linguist, I pulled the quote or the words, the power of the words to mean. Considering the refrain, why does everything have to be about race? How does the concept of race as a meta language challenge this complaint? And I think this is where I go right to Fields, who tells
Absolutely.
who tells us that the idea that one person has of another, even when we have the most striking physical characteristics, is meditated by the social context within which the two come in contact. That social context is always going to shape the way we engage with each other.
And that race is also kind of plagued by this kind of need to supplant a different hierarchy, or not even hierarchy, a different form of social relation, which was slavery. Um, Slavery being like a complete manner of slave society, being a complete manner of living for not just the slave, but also the master, the overseer, plantation society. And so um, the economy. And so then she goes into, in the rest of that paragraph, the kind of nested relationships um, that are then forged and then dismantled, quote unquote, by the dissolution of, plantation society. But what happens in the kind of disposal of the master slave relationship is the emergence of a race concept to supplant the master slave relationship and all of these supplementary categories there within, to also supplant or support the concept of race, to which the not just the master slave narrative is just one aspect of plantation society, to which the plantation society falls. You also have an economic system of class, a system of ordering, a system of gender that would also fall in a plantation society, right? um and so recognizing that race is being operationalized, it's embodied, it's kind of it's experienced, um and about power, um but it can't um be divorced from this kind of historical uprooting of plantation society, which he identifies through
People are always so resistant to this idea that when you're talking about, particularly, the way we discuss Black women, that like slavery is very related to that, and it's like, why do you always have to go back to slavery? I mean, it wasn't that long ago.
it really was, in the grand scheme of existence, it really wasn't that long ago. The more and more I study like the 20th century, and I'm like, you know, and slavery is on the other side of that, and we're on the other side of that, of the 20th century, I'm like, that was a blip. And so much was not resolved in the 20th century at all.
Because we immediately, like, we get into the 20th century, and like Black political thought leaders are immediately like, distance yourself from the African. When the African wasn't the African back on the African continent, it's the African was a slave, right? Like that
Mm-hmm.
was, they move on from calling each other enslaved people to just calling people who are coming off the plantation Africans. And that
Mm-hmm.
you need to come into, African American wasn't a term yet, Black wasn't even a term used yet, that you need to come into an American Negro politic that's
Mm-hmm.
largely being shaped by white Protestants that want to keep you out of their neighborhoods.
Yeah.
Word Higginbotham and Righteous Discontent. But like, the turn of the century, when you look at there's a good bit of history that you can read on the turn of the century and read about Atlanta and the making of it becoming like a black metropolis. And that like in Atlanta and Memphis both were able to have black business leaders come into that city before emancipation because of the setup of the lack of plantation lifestyles in those cities. But you could just read the history of either of those two cities, and there's so much context around how quickly the black community, from people that are positioned as leaders in the community, seek to distance themselves from what happened in slavery by acting like you can just rise above it.
Yeah.
And then the sort of tentacles that come from that plantation lifestyle. um
Sorry, I was just thinking our awareness of these things, I feel like in the last 20, this is something I've been thinking about for a long time. I feel like our like as a collective conscious, which I feel like is both easier and harder to say in a more globalized world, right? Like in like the Harlem Renaissance, it's more easy. It's in some ways easier to say a generalized we when you don't have access to more of a we, right? You can more speak to it. But anyways, I feel like I feel like the level of detachment to these ideas within the last 20 years, it's like wild. No, it just I feel like there's a sense of like disconnect from um I don't know. Perhaps that's a separate issue, but I feel like even because this text is in 1992, right? And so I feel like and I don't know, maybe if like on the last day maybe we could, or that should be a separate live. I know that Higginbotham did like a reconvening on Metalanguage, like some years later. But I'm curious what she thinks about metalanguage of race in a more contemporary period, in a more contemporary context, right? Because the way that language operates, not even just language about race, but the way that language operates in a more kind of like globalized world is very, very different. But also the way that we talk about race in the contemporary period is like wildly different. Um, but I don't know. Those are slightly tangential thoughts.
which is fine.
So sorry.
It's all good. It's all good. Oh, I was like listening and then didn't pull up the next question. Consider the example of Sojourner Truth. How does her narrative highlight how the construction of enslaved Black women's gender was racialized and thus moved us outside of the legal definition of woman? And I think that actually gets into the next two paragraphs, which I did not read.
Oh, I
If
can
you
read that.
you can read them.
Yes, I can. Excuse me. All right. Wasn't Sojourner Truth a woman? The courts answered this question for slave women by ruling them outside the statutory rubric woman. In discussing the case State of Missouri versus Celia, A. Leon Higginbotham Jr., which any relation?
I
Um,
I believe.
relation?
I think that is her dad or her husband. No.
Oh, okay. Elucidates the racial signification of gender. Celia was 14 years old when purchased by a successful farmer, Robert Newsom. During the 5 years of his ownership, Newsom habitually forced her into sexual intercourse. At age 19, she had borne a child by him and was expecting another. In June 1855, while pregnant and ill, Celia defended herself against attempted rape by her master. Her testimony reveals that she warned him she would hurt him if he continued to abuse her while sick. When her threats would not deter his advances, she hit him over the head with a stick, immediately killing him. In an act presaging Richard Wright's native son, she then burned his body in the fireplace and the next morning spread his ashes on the pathway. Celia was apprehended and tried for first-degree murder. Her counsel sought to lower the charge of first degree to murder in self-defense, arguing that Celia had a right to resist her master's sexual advances, especially because of the imminent danger to her health. A slave master's economic and property rights, the defense contended, did not include rape. The defense rested its case on Missouri statutes that protected women from attempts to ravish, rape, or defile. The language of these particular statutes explicitly used the term any woman, while other unrelated Missouri statutes explicitly used the terms such as white female and slave or Negro in their criminal codes. The question centered on her womanhood. The court found Celia guilty. Quote, if Newsom was in the habit of having intercourse with a defendant who was his slave, it is murder in the first degree. Celia was sentenced to death, having been denied an appeal, and was hanged in December 1855 after the birth of her child. Since racially based justifications of slavery stood at the core of Southern law, race relations, and social etiquette in general, then proof of quote unquote womanhood did not rest on a common female essence, shared culture, or mere physical appearance. Sojourner Truth, on one occasion, was forced to bare her breasts to a doubting audience in order to vindicate her womanhood. This is not to deny gender's role within the social and power relations of race. Black women experienced the vicissitudes of slavery through gendered lives and thus differently from slave men. They bore and nursed children and performed domestic duties, all on top of doing field work. Unlike slave men, slave women fell victim to rape, and precisely because of their gender. Yet gender itself was both constructed and fragmented by race. Gender, so colored by race, remained from birth until death inextricably linked to one's personal identity and social status. For black and white women, gendered identity was reconstructed and represented in very different, indeed antagonistic, racialized contexts.
Yes, yes, yes. This section on gender is a little short, mostly because I feel like we revisit gender, particularly under the much longer section of class, and then again in sexuality.
And I think that also those are often framed pop culturally as the most antagonistic. I think that race and class are understood as complementary a lot of the times. I think that, people don't talk about class and gender together a lot of times. That seems, if you're poor and a woman, that's pretty understood, right? Um, but I think that people perceive race and gender as the kind of Evander Holyfield, Mike Tyson of identity concepts, and purely as identitarian concepts, right? Defensively identity concepts, and not necessarily as power concepts or socially constructed concepts. The bout of the black man versus the white woman kind of quasi discussion. So I think it's good to meditate on this separately, because I think that this might be a harder one to set up, and I think she even starts with that as like, I see that white feminist theorists struggle the most with integrating race into their concepts, right? And so she's seeing a struggle with race and gender especially, and then at the end we see later on she talks about how black scholars struggle with incorporating gender too. So I think it's reasonable for us to meditate on this one a little bit.
I agree. I'm like going back through my notes. Yeah, I had a lot more notes under race.
Fair, fair.
uh, how does race? Let's move outside the definition of legal.
You want me to reread the question?
Oh yeah.
I can do that. All right. So is the one about Sojourner Truth, correct? So, studies of enslaved black women's histories highlight how race shapes gender's power to mean. On page 257, the racial justifications for slavery ensured that womanhood did not rest on a common female essence, shared culture, or mere physical appearance. Consider the example of Sojourner Truth. How does her narrative highlight how the construction of enslaved black women's gender was racialized and thus moved them outside of the legal definition of woman?
Yeah, and this is probably like the one of the theories that I like bring up a lot in regards to the dating discourse that happens on social media, and particularly that's come about in the age of social media, where because visual aesthetic markers are what's motivating a lot of the conversation. I think the way that one misinformation and then harm is moved through the sort of discourse is obscured. Like it's easier to hide because like, well, this person's a stay-at-home girlfriend in a luxury apartment. Like, why would you argue against that? Like visually, it gives all the right things. You're talking about things that are unseen. But I'm constantly bringing up this idea or this theory about like who gets to be a woman, and that a lot of these aesthetic markers are again boxing us into definitions of what is the right kind of woman, what's the good kind of woman, what is a true womanhood. And it's reinvesting in these same systems, these same structures that kept us boxed in or boxed out beforehand. And it's keeping the same broad group of black women again boxed out. We reinvest in Victorian ideals of womanhood that are just repackaged under the soft life. They're just repackaged under new nomenclature. And it still goes back to this same kind of connection where Sojourner Truth is being antagonized about not being a woman because she's a black formerly enslaved woman, um, or rather what they call female. And she has to, she bears her breasts, and she talks about birthing children that are taken away from her, and like, h- how are you to then tell her she's not a woman?
And even that, the bearing of breasts, I mean, was purely mockery because they had, Sarah Bartman was, and excuse the pronunciation because I don't know how to pronounce her proper name, first name, but her, is it like Search? Don't get me to ignorance, but they had her on display like an exhibition for years, to like her body fully exposed, right? And so the kind of exposition of the body raw wasn't evidence enough of, womanhood to them, right? She was still, sexual prop, right? um Even, I guess, in the eyes of the law. And in the instance of the court case of Celia, she was, again, sexual prop, had, the faculties of a woman, right, in its best approximation, right, to a white woman, but still not a woman. So Sojourner Truth exposing her bare breasts proved a what? Right? And so it proved power. It proved that they had the power to enforce that she could bear her breasts, right? It proved nothing at all about her womanhood. It only proved that they had the authority over her to have her to bear her breasts. And so it's always going to be a moving goalpost of what womanhood is in accordance to those who have the power to have such authority. Um, and so I think that, yeah, I think that black women will be will be constantly constructed outside of the margin when and where it's serviceable to them. Maybe your favorite um black racially ambiguous pop star won't be today, but she gets out of line, too far out of line, too far out of the racial chat, and she's out of it tomorrow, so I think I don't even think that womanhood is very stringently defined for the oppressor. I think that it is just, it's um I think it's as fluidly operational for them as much as it is about power. Um, and I think I mean, even her citing Foucault as evidence to that is just how much I think her claims about the kind of nested ways these things operate is about protecting power. Maybe I'm just reading too much Fanon right now, but yeah.
But that's the point. When you read stuff like this, it's supposed to like it's meant to bring you to other intellectuals, to other academics, to like reference their work. I mean, half the page, or well, a quarter of the page is taken up with her binos, and Evelyn Higginbotham is her husband. Um,
I don't know why when I was reading it the first time, I thought that that was a name in the case. And I was like, bitch, did you just tell on your great great granddaddy or something? Like, it was like a name in the case. Anyways, I'd be
no,
tired.
that's her husband. Um, Gender, so colored by race, remain from birth until death, inextricably linked to one's personal identity and social status. For Black and white women, gendered identity was reconstructed and represented in different, indeed antagonistic, racialized contexts. So she's laying this argument, right, that gender is heavily touched by race. That you cannot talk about, and I mean, in the early '90s, I think Higginbotham's argument is against white feminists. Um, and this is why we do these readings, right? Because this whole narrative that sort of Black feminism is the same as capital F feminism, and there isn't a whole broad spectrum of academic critiques against capital F feminism, and how you cannot talk about uh, Black womanhood without also considering the racialized aspect of it. It's there. It's in the foundational text. We're reading one of them right now where she's laying down this argument that gender is heavily racialized. And it's not even so much racialized and simply this idea that you're a white woman and I'm a Black woman, but particularly how Black women engage in language amongst intercommunally with Black people about womanhood and who can be a lady and who can be proper and who can be the right kind of woman.
Yes. I
You thinking of a book? You're trying to look behind you and find it.
yes. Um I see it. So it's Chained in Silence by Tabitha
Talithia.
LeFleur or
Yes, I have.
Talithia.
I too. Go
We're
ahead.
in the same book.
Maybe I don't. Maybe it's on my bookshelf because I did Sarah Haley's um No Mercy Here, which is
Nice.
they're often quoted together.
Oh, they are?
Yes.
Um, was good. Well, I was going to recommend, if not the whole book, because I think it's a pretty not an easy read. It's very hard, but like content wise, but like it's not dense. And there's pictures and it's a good story. But at least there's a chapter. Have you read it?
Mhm.
Oh, so about the woman prisoner. It's about chain gangs in Georgia. For those who don't know, chain gangs just being again in that 20th century, that really long 20th century. Obviously 13th, the documentary brought to light a lot of like and also Michelle Alexander brought to light a lot about like the continuity of like mass incarceration
So the idea
um
of
from like
pathologizing Black men.
slavery.
Yeah.
Yes. And so chain gangs were kind of instrumental to that legacy of from slavery, its continuity into the mass prison industrial complex and private prisons, especially now, especially private prisons, because in Georgia, um, the kind of making of the entire railroad systems, public, a lot of public access, public government, not even government, public systems, private systems, all these things, railroad systems, especially in the South, were funded or built by chain gangs. Anyways, that's the context for it. It was a really shoddy synopsis. Sorry, Miss Dr. LaFleur. But anyways, it's a great book. It's a great read, and there is a bit about one of the few documented women prisoners. in Georgia, and how it talks about when, Professor Darlene Clark Hines talks about cultures of dissemblance. Well, no, I'm citing the wrong thing, citing the very wrong thing. When she talks, some Black feminists just talking about kind of modes of resistance. Um, and one of the things that she would do is just not clean her body, and she would create just funk, and she would smell, and that was just her way of just keeping the guards off of her body, just kind of discouraging sexual assault, and that was her way of taking bodily autonomy. And in a way, that was her, in their way of construing, she was, people were taken into chain gangs for being vagrants. They had children in chain gangs, women, families, people that they just saw as, not being able to integrate into civil society, people that they just wanted to make money off of. And so there were all types of people in chain gangs, people who with disabilities, with mental health issues, anything. And so people that they saw as disposable. And so she was already seen as on the margins of what was acceptable as a person, let alone as a woman, but would still be assaulted and taken advantage of. And so to further assume a place, to distance herself even further away, to take that choice to further herself away from any possibilities, to say I don't want to be even approximated in this any sort of desirable position, so that she could have personal safety. She took any sort of ridicule and all this stuff. I just have like deep admiration for the funk. And I know that sounds like really just like childish, but like honestly, that's like that takes like a huge kind of just like cognitive, like ontological, like this world is fucked up.
No, I know, I
You
love
read things
that.
like that.
I love that you
You
have
read you
a
read a few things
personal,
like that.
deep respect for the funk. I love the way
I'm
you
not
even
saying I'm funky. I'm just
no,
saying.
but I
You
love
saw
that. And
Julie
no,
saw me wash my face. I'm just saying.
no, but
I'm just
you know,
saying.
even though she has me blocked, who just recently did a video on
Oh my
Black
god,
women's
stop it.
attachment to hygiene, which is a historical I appreciate the Black feminist historical approach to that topic. What's her name? I could see her face. Let me look. She just did a video on YouTube not too long ago, and it got a
It's
lot of
like
views.
it's like Khadijah something.
No, not Khadijah does not have me blocked.
Okay.
Oh man, I could see her. She does sex work. I could see her. Intellectual media. Black women in the hygiene Olympics. No clue why she has me blocked on Twitter, but she does. And no, but like I think I saw that video and I was like, no, this makes so much sense. Like kudos to her for approaching that topic, because as you said, Talithia LaFlora, I maybe haven't done word to revisiting the text. I haven't done as deep reading of Chained in Silence as I have done of Sarah Haley's No Mercy Here. And often in book reviews, those two books are reviewed together because
Gotcha.
Haley also looks at the chain gang in Georgia during the. Uh, I think maybe she's a little closer to the. Well, maybe it is the same time period. I think LaFlora might be like the turn of the 20th century,
Yeah,
and
she's more a little more contemporary.
Haley is maybe more 30s, 40s, 50s. And I
Gotcha.
should know because I read that book a good three times myself. But the thing that stands
Okay.
out specifically about Haley, who works a lot with Sadia Hartman, is that she, and I think LaFloria as well, are a part of historians who invest in a Black feminist methodology, right? Because the school of history is very, very conservative in its approach. And they do with Jennifer Morgan and Jessica Johnson this idea of reading against the grain and finding us in the margins of the archives because we are not named. And so the example that you bring from LaFloria, right, of this Black woman who one of the first documentations of her being put on the chain gang and she keeps herself funky to keep harm away. And the chain gang was extremely violent, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not even just violent in the way that the imprisoned chain gang members engaged with each other, violent in being a woman in a male dominated prison, violent in the way that the the parole officers and the, you know, the overseers and all the people that are running these agencies, that, you know, violent in the way that your labor is being forced to help build railroads and make, you know, private white, you know, private people, private, build private wealth for individuals. But also just kind of like violent in the whole existence of what you're doing, right? This extraordinarily hard labor. And, you know, we understand, like, in the present tense, like coal mining and doing these sort of hard labor jobs like shortens your lifespan. Like, this is very, very hard on the body. And then you also have to think of like that sort of level of exhaustion, and then also having to think about your own personal safety, and then having a commitment to the funk, as you would put it, to
I wish
keep
I had
yourself
said
safe. You know, the way that you wish you hadn't said it. It's a little juvenile, but like, no, but it's good. But it's like, you know, to bring, I mean, I think academics might be like, let's not memify something that was very, very violent. But also when you think about having these conversations with everyday people who maybe get a little turned off when you start talking about academic texts, being able to use language that brings them into the understanding of like that, like the weight of what you're talking about, I think is very useful. So I actually like the term.
And it's also just a really good story. It's this is I'm gonna tell you that this is a story that I read almost 10 years ago, and I still remember it this vividly because it's a good it impacted me that much. Like, it was a very good story.
Yeah, like, has as Haley does, she talks about the idea about like pulling from Robin Kelly's uh Freedom. I have this book right
Freedom
here.
Dreams.
Yeah,
Freedom
Freedom Dreams.
Dreams, yeah.
I'm looking at the
Mhm.
cover. And as you were talking about rethinking about what would typically in the archives be listed as criminal acts, right? So this deeply funky woman, for LaFloria to read the documentation about this woman in prison and see this as an act of resistance is a commitment to a Black feminist methodology that reads against the grain. Because in the text, she's probably listed as queer, as which was a way to say that they were mentally unhealthy, that they were nasty, that they did not they had the body of a female, but they were not a woman. And the text would blatantly state that these people were not considered women.
Mhm.
Um, and that was also justification for their imprisonment for simply staying, you know, being down at the saloon and having a shot or something. They were in prison for like wild stuff. Like in Haley's text, there's an example of a young woman who's in prison for taking flowers from a white woman's garden, and she's saying that taking the flowers from the garden was actually an act of resistance. That you read it in the record as a criminal act and a disregard for personal property, but that was an act of resistance from young women who were consistently being harassed by, you know, these white people on the street. And you know, the ways that we like seek joy are actually also radical acts of resistance. You know, the desire or the way in which you a Black domestic laborer might take it upon them to get rest, which typically in the record is listed as them being lazy. That's an act of resistance when they're told that they're not allowed rest, that they continually have to work for low means.
Mhm.
You know, and Chained in Silence is a really great book. I like that canon. That's like kind of my wheelhouse in history of like that canon of work that rethinks how we have specifically talked about low income Black women who don't fit into this Victorian standard of womanhood, and what that when we actually consider them and their humanness and the intricacies of their intimate lives, like when we consider all those things, what that really illuminates about the history of Black women in this country and how we get to the language and the discourse that we have today around things like sprinkle sprinkle. Yeah. Does it track? Deep sigh, revolutionary sigh. I'm telling you, these reads are so good. I'm gonna next week work on doing more promotion for the meta language of race, because
It's
I
a good
really,
it's a good one.
yeah, you know, during the pandemic when everyone was home, we hit a real good lick with Black feminist thought, and I feel like, and then we hit a good lick with Spillers too, and that's not an easy text. So like, come on, y'all, come on over. All right, we can end out here. Thank you for joining me, CJ. I'll be streaming from Florida next week.
Oh.
Yeah, going to see Beyonce
Oh my
and be at my
goodness.
mama house next week.
You gonna be on mute?
I'm not. I'm really. I'm gonna. You know. I'm gonna attend my Zoom.
Josie not gonna be on mute, y'all.
Be on the Zoom. I'm gonna be on the Zoom. I'm gonna be on the Zoom call about being mute. I'm gonna be mute. But y'all not gonna stress me out about having a good time and enjoying myself at that damn concert.
That's right. That's
Thank you.
right.
'Cause I paid a good coin for them tickets, so I'm gonna have me a good time. Okay.
That's right.
All right. See everybody next week. Thank you for joining in. Bye.